Hey guys, it's Jasper, and today we're going to be reading part 2 of chapter 8 of The Princess and the Goblin. Pairing with today's reading, I thought it would be fitting, as it's been a while, that we have a little toast to our Scottish author George MacDonald with a little Glenfiddich. And just to make sure it's all appropriately dressy, as this is a book study, we've got our teacup, which we will drink the fiddick out of. It's how they do it in Scotland. As always, pour yourself something yummy to drink. Relax, enjoy, and cheers. Chapter 8, Part 2. He now knew at least one of the reasons for the constant sound of the goblin hammers and pickaxes at night. They were making new houses for themselves, to which they might retreat when the miners should threaten to break into their dwellings. But he had learned two things of far greater importance. The first was that some grievous calamity was preparing, and almost ready to fall upon the heads of the miners. The second was the one weak point of a goblin's body. He had not known that their feet were so tender, as he had now reason to suspect. He had heard it said that they had no toes. He had never had the opportunity of inspecting them closely in the dusk in which they always appeared, to satisfy himself whether it was correct to report. Indeed, he had not been able to satisfy himself as to whether they had no fingers, although this was also commonly said to be the fact. One of the miners, indeed, who had been more schooling than the rest, was wont to argue that such must have been primordial condition of humanity, and that education and handicraft had developed both toes and fingers, with which proposition Curdy had once heard his father sarcastically agree, alleging in support of its probability that babies' gloves were a traditional remnant of the old state of things, while the stockings of all ages, no regard being paid in them to toes, pointed in the same direction. But what was of importance was the fact concerning the softness of goblin feet, which he foresaw might be useful to all miners. What he had to do, in the meantime, however, was to discover, if possible, the special evil design the goblins now had in their heads. Although he knew all the gangs and all their natural galleys with which they communicated in the mined part of the mountain, he had not the least idea where the palace of the king of the gnomes was. Otherwise, he would have set out at once on the enterprise of discovering what the said design was. He judged, and rightly, that it must lie in a farther part of the mountain, between which the mine there was as yet no communication. There must be one nearly completed, however, for it could be but a thin partition which now separated them. If only he could get through in time to follow the goblins as they retreated. A few blows would doubtless be sufficient, just where his ear now lay. But if he attempted to strike there with his pickaxe, he would only hasten the departure of the family, put them on guard, and perhaps lose their involuntary guidance. He therefore began to feel the wall with his hands, and soon found that some of the stones were loose enough to be drawn out with little noise. Laying hold of a large one with both of his hands, he drew it gently out and let it down softly. "What's that noise?" said the goblin father. Curdy blew out his light, lest it should shine through. "It must be one of the miners that stayed behind the rest," said the mother. "No, he's been gone a good while. I haven't heard a blow for an hour. Besides, it wasn't like that." "Then I suppose it must have been a stone carried down the brook inside." "Perhaps. It'll have more room by and by." Curdy kept still. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, mingled with an occasional word of direction, and anxious to know whether the removal of the stone had made an opening into the goblin's house, he put in his hand to feel. It went in a good way, and then came in contact with something soft. He had but a moment to feel it over. It was so quickly withdrawn. It was one of the toeless goblin feet. The owner of it gave a cry of fright. "What's the matter, Helfer?" asked his mother. "A beast came out of the wall and licked my foot." "Nonsense! There are no wild beasts in our country," said his father. But it was, Father. I felt it. Oh.
Nonsense, I say. Will you malign your native realms and reduce them to the level of the country upstairs? That is swarming with wild beasts of every description.
But I did feel it, Father.
I tell you to hold your tongue. You're no patriot.
Gertie suppressed his laughter and lay still as a mouse, but no stiller. For every moment he kept nibbling away with his fingers at the edge of the hole. He was slowly making it bigger, for here the rock had been very much shattered with the blasting. There seemed to be a good many in the family, to judge from the mass of confused talk, which now and then came through the hole. But when all were speaking together, and just as if they had bottle brushes, each at least one, in their throats, it was not easy to make out much that was said. At length he heard once more what the Father Goblin was saying.
Now then, he said, get your bundles on your backs. Here, Helfer, I'll help you with your chest.
I wish it was my chest, Father.
Your turn will come in good time enough. Make haste, I must go to the meeting at the palace tonight. When that's over, we can come back and clear out the last of the things before our enemies return in the morning. Now light your torches and come along. What a distinction it is to provide our own light, instead of being dependent on that thing hung up in the air, a most disagreeable contrivance, intended no doubt to blind us when we venture out in a baleful influence. Quite glaring and vulgar, I call it, though no doubt useful to poor creatures who haven't the wit to make light for themselves.
Gertie could hardly keep himself from calling through, to know whether they made the fire to light their torches by. But a moment's reflection showed him that they would have said they did, inasmuch as they struck two stones together, and the fire came. What we see in the second half of this chapter is what we've seen in the former, along with some of the chapters leading up to this. Gertie showcases courage and reason. We see Gertie's reason in the way he pieces together and processes the information he gains from the goblin conversation. We see his courage in his decision to follow the goblins, and further in the statement that said, if he knew where the goblin palace was, he would make his way straight to there without hesitation. We see his reason when he shows caution as he attempts to follow the goblin family, moving along slowly and not with haste. We see his courage when he reaches out through the hole and accidentally touches the one single toe of the goblin child, and instead of pulling his hand back and shrieking, he stays silent. Instead of fleeing and getting the heck out of there like I might be wanting to do, he stays put in his work. And finally, we see his reason when he holds back on saying the things he'd like to shout out in response to the goblins, and what he sees largely as their ignorant point of view. Gertie is a character who embodies a fine example of courage and reason. And what I'd like to do today is ask you a question in the hopes that we can have a bit of a conversation about it down below. 1. Can you think of another story which builds a character like Gertie? 2. Do you like the character being built in Gertie? And 3. How is he different, if he's different, than characters you've seen before? As always, guys, I hope whatever you've been drinking has been good, that the conversation and story have been a fair match. Cheers and cheers.